So, what I was saying, at the same time as there was an apparent greater need for humanitarian intervention in the 1990s because of the instability generated by the end of the Cold War, which had produced conflicts and atrocities and so on. At the same time, there seemed to be a greater opportunity to carry out such interventions because the collapse of the Soviet Union meant Russia was less willing and less able to block actions at the UN or to just prevent them from happening outside the UN either. So there was seen as a greater need, but there's also a greater opportunity to take action in the UN that had not been possible when the Soviet Union had existed. Okay, I hope that's clear. So, point being, since the 1990s, there's been increasing calls, especially in the West, for humanitarian interventions to deal with atrocities, particularly atrocities that are occurring in the context of conflicts and civil wars and so on. Two key cases, and I won't go into them in great detail because I've asked you to do a bit of research on these anyway, which we'll talk about in class. But two key cases that really led to growing calls for intervention. One was what was labelled a genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Horrific conflict in Rwanda in 1994. Massacre of around 800,000 people, mostly Tutsis. There are two main ethnic groups in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus. And there was a huge massacre, some would even call it a genocide, against mainly against Tutsis by the Hutu majority. And many people argued as well that there was actually that the government, which is a Hutu-led government, was actually complicit in that genocide against Tutsis. Remember, when we looked at the ICC and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Prime Minister at the time, in 1994, in Rwanda, was actually jailed for genocide and crimes against humanity. And the point about this, I won't go into all the details about it, but the point was there was not an intervention carried out. There were these calls, they were very moving. You could hear broadcasts from the radio saying, "We're going to be killed with our families. Please do something to save us." These calls went out, these militias are coming, they're going to kill us, please do something to save us. And the rest of the world didn't intervene. They didn't send in troops to prevent the massacres taking place and so on. And in hindsight, a lot of people have said, well, this was a stain on the conscience of the international community. The rest of the world knew something was happening, knew something was going to happen, knew something was happening, knew these horrific massacres were taking place and did nothing to stop them. So there was, especially when the scale of the massacres became clear, as I say, nearly 1 million people massacred in the space of a few months, there was a real, I suppose, feeling of guilt amongst other countries that they really should have done something, and that if a similar situation were to occur in the future, they really should do something to stop it getting as bad as it did in Rwanda. And you often hear this when people call for humanitarian intervention in a specific context. They'll often say we need to prevent another Rwanda, by which they're sort of appealing to the guilt, to the feeling that we let this happen in Rwanda, we shouldn't let it happen here. 2 years later, the Yugoslav Civil War was very, very complex, a number of different dimensions to them. Yugoslavia was, just to give you a little bit of the detail of the background, Yugoslavia was what's called a federal state made up of 6 different nations. In the same way as the UK was not a federal state, actually, the UK, but it's made of 4 nations, isn't it? England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. There were 6 different component nations of Yugoslavia. It was a federal state, meaning each of those components had a certain degree of autonomy in their own parliaments and so on. Now, the Yugoslav Civil War started in the early 1990s as some of those states wanted to break away from Yugoslavia, and Croatia and Slovenia did break away very early in the 1990s. And then other states started to want to break away. The problem came when Bosnia, one of the component states, or component parts of the Federation of Yugoslavia, Bosnia didn't have a single, main majority ethnicity. So Bosnia was comprised of multi-ethnic part of Yugoslavia, later became a state in its own right, comprising Bosnian Muslims who had been there since the days when it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire. And then there were Croats, ethnic Croatians, and ethnic Serbs as well. So Bosnia was comprised of these three different ethnicities. So then when it looked like Bosnia was going to become independent, of course the question was, well, which of these three groups are going to control independent Bosnia? And so they became fighting between militias representing these different three ethnicities. So the Bosnian Civil War was a kind of civil war within the overall Yugoslav civil wars. It became very brutal and bloody. And within the Bosnian Civil War, there was a particular massacre called the Srebrenica massacre in 1996, where it's believed that around 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were rounded up and killed by Bosnian Serb forces. And so again, there was this, when the scale of what happened became clear, there were kind of calls to say, look, we mustn't let this happen again. So it's these two incidents, these two massacres and atrocities, very, very important to understand the growing calls that came later for humanitarian intervention. Rwanda and Srebrenica, both seen as cases where the international community allowed massacres and atrocities to take place, and that was really a stain on the conscience of the world that should not be allowed to repeat itself. So these two events led to growing calls that, look, something should be done in these kind of situations. So then you get the Kosovo War, again occurring within Yugoslavia, part of the Yugoslav civil wars. Kosovo is a part of Serbia, which is itself one of the component parts of Yugoslavia. And Serbia as a whole is obviously majority populated by ethnic Serbs, but Kosovo, although it's part of Serbia, is majority populated by ethnic Albanians. And the ethnic Albanians had an independence movement, something like the IRA or the ANC in South Africa or whatever, called the Kosovan Liberation Army, demanding independence for Kosovo from Serbia. And so there was a civil war basically taking place between the KLA, who were demanding an independent Kosovo, and the Yugoslav army, who of course wanted Kosovo to remain part of Serbia and remain overall part of Yugoslavia. And allegations began emerging of ethnic cleansing of ethnic Albanians by Yugoslav forces. In other words, the allegation was, look, the Yugoslav forces are not just targeting the KLA militants, they're actually waging a war against the ethnic Albanian population as a whole. References were made to Rwanda and Srebrenica. We mustn't allow these kind of massacres, this kind of genocide to take place again. And in the midst of all this, Tony Blair formulated what he called the Doctrine of the International Community, a famous speech he gave in Chicago, where he argued that state sovereignty must not be allowed to be used as a free pass for dictators and corrupt rulers and so on to massacre their own citizens and massacre their own opposition movements. So he was really, and if such rulers do use state sovereignty as an excuse to do this, there should be limits on that sovereignty, and the international community, the rest of the world, basically should take steps to intervene and actually basically invade and put a stop to those atrocities. That was his basic argument. We should also note the West was already upset with Yugoslavia, at that time ruled by President Milosevic, who'd been very popular in Yugoslavia, elected 3 times. And because Yugoslavia still had a largely socialist economy, it hadn't privatized, it hadn't gone along with the demands of the IMF for structural adjustment and privatization and so on. It would refuse to open up to Western investment, TNCs, transnational corporations and so on. And yet it was still relatively successful and popular. And there's an argument the West really didn't want this to catch on. Especially, you see, in Russia at that time, that was privatizing. Russia was being completely devastated. Huge unemployment, massive collapse even in life expectancy as people were thrown out of work, left with no benefits, welfare state that existed under communism more or less closed down and so on. There was a real fear that the seeming success of kind of socialist Yugoslavia, compared with the seeming disaster unfolding in newly capitalist Russia, this could send the wrong message to the world. They didn't want that to catch on, and they didn't want the Yugoslavia's resistance to the IMF, resistance to neoliberal capitalism to take on. intervention that had been proposed by the US and Britain under Tony Blair was not authorized by the UN Security Council because of Russian opposition. Russia and Yugoslavia were still fairly close. But Russia was too weak to prevent the attack. In the end, NATO decided to attack Yugoslavia illegally without UN Security Council support, and Russia was really too weak to really do much about it. The attack by NATO lasted 78 days of bombing all parts of Yugoslavia, and eventually Yugoslav troops were forced out of Kosovo. And today Kosovo is recognized by many countries, not all countries, as independent. The problem was, following this, and this is important when we consider the rights and wrongs of humanitarian intervention in later lessons and lectures, once the ethnic Albanians of the KLA came to power, they actually had quite a supremacist attitude themselves. In other words, believed that their ethnicity was supreme and superior over others. And they began to actually start massacring the minority populations, the ethnic cleansing of the Jewish population, and particularly of the ethnic Serb population, for example, and the Gypsy population. A lot of violence and ethnic cleansing. Hundreds of Serb churches were destroyed and burnt to the ground and so on. And the Serbs and Jews really chased out of Kosovo. It was basically ethnically cleansed of non-Albanian groups. Kosovo today is often seen as what's called a gangster state. Leading members of the KLA in the new Kosovan government have been linked to criminal gangs involved in drug running, heroin smuggling, people smuggling, and also organ trafficking, when you kidnap people, kill them and take their organs and sell their organs to be used as organ donors. So arguably, actually, NATO has brought to power forces that themselves have committed ethnic cleansing, which was the very crime that NATO was supposed to go in to prevent. So these are some of the dangers and downsides, of course, of intervention. So that was Kosovo, 1999. The following year, Sierra Leone, in 2000, there was a rebel uprising by a group called the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF. A rebel uprising against the government. It'd been, by the way, again, another link to a previous topic. The RUF was